World War II is full of heroic stories that resemble the myths of the past, legends of men who, against all adversity, managed to overcome gigantic challenges against a powerful rival like Nazi Germany. Like the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, in December 1944, 22 Americans resisted the onslaught of more than 500 soldiers of the Third Reich. The beautiful Belgian forests in the Ardennes region were the setting. Throughout a day full of fire and blood, that context transformed into a true hell on Earth. The most incredible thing is that for decades, the American feat remained almost secret, like a legend that was shared orally. That is why in this new military history video, we want to review the incredible events that occurred in the Battle of Lanzerath and what was the fate of those soldiers. Let's get started. By the end of 1944, the German army was in serious trouble. Their last forces were pressed from all sides. The Red Army arrived from the east with the intention of conquering Berlin. From the south, English and American troops had defeated the Italians. In the heart of Europe, the German defensive line, known as the Siegfried Line, resisted the Allied advance after their crucial victory at Normandy. In this context, Adolf Hitler was ready to strike one last blow, expecting a sharp and decisive turn in the conflict. The plan was risky and involved a race against time to dominate key bridges and cities in Belgium, so they could surprise their rivals.
The Germans had their backs against the wall. It was clear that the Russians were coming, and there weren't enough Germans to stop them. So Hitler decided he was going to win on the Western Front so that he could free up all those forces and then turn on the Russians.
That was why the forests of the Ardennes became the scene of some of the bloodiest battles of the last part of the Second World War. In that region, there was a small group of 22 Americans belonging to the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon of the 394th Regiment. These men had been specially chosen for the dangerous role of collecting information and reconnoitering the battlefield behind enemy lines. They were intelligent recruits, in excellent physical condition, and with a brutal average in long-distance shooting tests. Although until then they didn't have a legendary reputation, since they were mostly in charge of intelligence tasks, they wrote their name among the most glorious pages of the military history of the 20th century. But that was not easy. On the other side, there was a formidable rival. In the same area were German troops, led by Field Officer Joachim Peiper, an expert on Belgian territory and one of the few personally decorated by Adolf Hitler. At just 29 years old, he was the youngest colonel-in-chief of the Waffen-SS. The cards were spread out on the table. On the morning of December 16, 1944, the Germans launched an attack that lasted 90 minutes. To do this, they used nearly 1,600 artillery pieces distributed along a 130-kilometer front. The intention was to destroy any type of ground defense before undertaking the advance proposed by the Führer. But there were no large armies there. In that area was the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon of the 394 Regiment. They were only aware of what was happening in their sector, so they thought it was an isolated phenomenon. His first impression was that the attack was a response to the Allied offensive that occurred days before on the routes to the north, in the town of Lanzerath. The hail of German fire was intense, some ammunition exploding in the trees, sending chunks of metal and burnt wood to the ground. Beyond the brutality, the American men were safe in their positions. Let's listen to the words of one of those boys.
I thought, well, one of these is going to land right on top of us, and that's it. We'll never know. But it's a terrible feeling. You know, it's just a constant, one after another, for 2 hours. I thought I'd never lived through anything as bad as that.
The German infantry began their advance while the artillery cordon was still operating. The idea was to penetrate the rival lines the instant the ammunition stopped falling from the sky. Since the sun had not yet risen, the men marched in the dark, guided by flashlights and the flash of the last shots. What they did not know is that they would soon be spotted by the enemy. Leading the American team was 20-year-old Lieutenant Lyle Book, a young but experienced military man. Once the artillery attack was completed, he sent 2 soldiers named Slape and Krieger to establish an observation post in an abandoned house in the eastern area of the Lanzerath village. Bauck accompanied them, and it was on that trip that he saw a terrifying image. Around 500 German troops advancing in the direction of the rest of the North American platoon. Thanks to the very particular helmet they used, the lieutenant could distinguish that they were Fallschirmjäger soldiers, the best and most trained in the entire Third Reich. All the experience in the world could not prepare men to face such a dangerous opponent, even more so if we take into account that they were outnumbered by a ratio of 20 to 1. This is how Lyle Buck himself describes that moment.
We could see them coming up the roadway. I told him, I'm going back to the platoon. Stay here and we'll see what happens next.
The young soldier returned with Slape to the team's original position to devise a plan of action. Meanwhile, Krieger stayed at the observation post with a radio to communicate with his companions. When you are in the middle of an armed conflict, it is not appropriate to withdraw when you see that things are not going well. Buck couldn't simply tell his 21 men that they had to flee the area before the Germans arrived. He had to ask permission. He called through his SCR 300 radio, with which he contacted the Hunningen barracks, but the response was not what he expected. As incredible as it may seem, they were given the order to maintain their position and wait for reinforcements from the 3rd Battalion who were on their way. From the village of Lanzerath, Private Krieger watched the German infantry advance. The curious thing is that on the Nazi side, they did not expect the presence of any Americans. Krieger contacted Buck to tell him the situation. The lieutenant sent soldiers Robinson, McGeehey, and Silvola to help him return. The trio sneaked stealthily to reach the position of their lone companion. However, before they could arrive, Krieger left the observation post, using a more direct route to the platoon. While he returned to the forest, the first fighting took place. It was he who killed a group of Germans, warning that there were well-hidden Allied forces in those Belgian areas. By the time the rescue team sent by Buch arrived at Lanzerath, the place was infested with Germans. The once quiet town was now under the rule of the Reich. After a brief but brave defensive operation, the 3 men were arrested. Around 9:30 in the morning, the 500 Reich soldiers were seen advancing along the main road of the town in the direction of the Allied soldiers. Although the Germans were aware that there were enemies nearby, they did not know their position and were convinced that they were small groups retreating. What they did not imagine was that Bauck's men not only had their usual rifles and weapons, but also had a 50 caliber machine gun built into the back of a Jeep and another 30 caliber cannon for special attacks. The intelligence and reconnaissance platoon opened fire at the moment the Germans began to leave the town. It was a surprising and lethal attack. The Allied rifles and machine guns caused multiple casualties on the Reich side. The Germans were desperate. They immediately ran to take up a defensive position, but were not quite sure of the direction from which the hostilities were coming. This is how almost a dozen Axis men perished, while the troops led by Buch only had. In their hearts, they feared that the Belgian forests hid hundreds of fierce Allied soldiers. As we indicated at the beginning of the video, at this point in World War II, the most scarce commodity was time. Germany needed to accelerate the pace of its mechanized troops and infantry in order to hit the Allied forces significantly. Despite the heavy losses suffered by the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon, Joachim Peiper's men had to undertake a second advance. For this second advance, they had a clear idea about the area where the enemy was. What they did not know was how many people were waiting there. Around 11:30 in the morning, a group of German soldiers advanced on the wooded area from which the shots came. They were determined to win, but a tragic outcome awaited them. To understand what happened, it is best to relive the words of Lieutenant Lyle Buck himself, who still shows compassion for those old rivals from more than 70 years ago.
And as they were hitting this fence, we were shooting them. And this went on for maybe, I couldn't tell you, 8 minutes, 10 minutes. Finally it stopped and everything quieted down. And if you can imagine what that looked like in the snow, it's hard to imagine.
The man's statements are forceful. That was a disgusting sight, a typical war massacre. The tactical advantage of the Americans was clear. They had hidden positions, a certain height, the protection of trees, and of course, their rifles and machine guns. Around 11:45, the survivors of the failed attack returned to cover again in the village of Lanzerath. Until this moment, we only knew the Allied perspective, that of the heroic soldiers who defeated a power that numerically surpassed them. But how did the Germans feel? What was it like to face an invisible enemy that wiped out your companions like flies? To understand this, we turn to the words of Rudi Frühbeißer, a German soldier who survived the confrontation. When the 3rd Company returned, Commander Schiele stumbled and would not get up. When someone turned him over, he told us it was a shot to the head. Others, like Mayer and Schmidt, have less severe injuries. Dr. Mathieu approached the wounded. He is easy to recognize by the red cross on his chest. While he was treating the victims, a gunshot was fired. Mathieu grabbed his head and fell forward. Another shot to the head. The Allied cartridges flew through the air and showered the region with fire. It was truly carnage. Although the second advance was also contained by the men of the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon, the truth is that the volume of German fire was already taking its toll. Many were wounded with gunshots that grazed their limbs. Others suffered serious injuries while trying to cover themselves. The worst part went to a young soldier whose face was disfigured by a grenade that did not explode, but caused him to lose several teeth. To give the scene an even more apocalyptic air, the Americans' radio was destroyed by bullet impacts. The .50 caliber machine gun was borderline overheating and needed immediate repairs to prevent the barrel from splitting in half. The Germans' third attack was different. They chose to surround the town and enter the forest from the side to surprise this invisible enemy. The strategy was effective. They advanced along the flanks and managed to go unnoticed by the already weak defense of the Americans. As the sun set, while Lyle Buch's men were treating the wounded, the Axis struck its final blow. In a matter of minutes, they managed to overcome the Americans, who were taken as prisoners almost without resistance. American soldiers remember that everything happened suddenly. Hundreds of armed men appeared from the shadows, shouting orders in German. It was the end of his epic. The reports are contradictory. Depending on the source we analyze, between 16 and 60 of Joachim Peiper's men died that day. Currently, it is impossible to determine a precise number. From Berlin, they tried to minimize this event as much as possible. Beyond this small blind spot in history, Washington's troops not only caused significant casualties against a much more powerful rival. His victory can be measured by an extremely valuable commodity: time. The almost 20 hours of delay suffered by the infantry of the Third Reich were decisive in making Hitler's plan in Belgium a complete failure. Life as a prisoner of war was hard for the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon of the 394th Regiment. Some had injuries so serious that they could not even be transported. Those standing, like Lieutenant Lyle Buch, were transported by train without food or water for a week. Although the Nazis were brutal and beat them almost daily, the Americans were able to avoid death. In inhumane conditions, they endured their stay in the detention centers established by Germany, but it was a matter of time before it all ended. After a few months, they were released once the war ended. You might imagine that such a group of heroes were received as icons of their country, as authentic symbols of the Allied spirit that defeated the Axis. Well, that was not the case. His story, like so many others, remained anonymous for decades. In such a gigantic war, in which millions of people died, a day of shootings in the Belgian forests is nothing more than a footnote. Of course, without the superhuman efforts of Boek's men, the fate of Europe could have been. In 1965, the United States Army published a series of historical volumes reviewing World War II. One of the books was dedicated to what happened in Belgium, but the author superficially mentioned the actions of Boek's platoon. The job came to William James, a member of that glorious team, who contacted his former lieutenant to convince him to do something about it. It was time to ask for the recognition they earned. After some letters and demands to Army authorities, in June 1966, a silver star arrived in Lyle Boek's mailbox, but no other members of the platoon were recognized. Luckily, the lieutenant was interviewed for a book of testimonies about what happened in Belgium. The man took the opportunity to describe in great detail the sacrifice of his men. Finally, on October 26, 1981, after years of pressure on politicians and military leaders, the men of the unit were decorated. 14 of them were present for the ceremony, which was carried out by the Secretary of the Army. Each earned a presidential citation, an award given to units of the armed forces for extraordinary heroism in action against an armed enemy. Others received Distinguished Service Crosses, as well as 5 Silver Stars and 9 Bronze Stars, among other medals. This made the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon of the 394th Regiment the most decorated unit of World War II. The incredible story of the 22 American soldiers who resisted against more than 500 enemies is a perfect example of the type of sacrifices that are necessary to win a war. War conflicts are brutal events, full of tragedy and death, but even in that context, there is room for heroism. It is thanks to men like those led by Lyle Boek that Europe and the world did not fall into the hands of Adolf Hitler. In this way, we reach the end of the video. If you like this type of content and want to continue learning about shocking events from the past, we invite you to subscribe and activate notifications. Without further ado, we say goodbye until the next installment of Military History.